Okay, now, the same story, of course, existed in Singapore. That is the idea that when the first ruler of India was Alexander the Great, Iskandar Zulkarnain. And so after he conquered all of India, then so he conquered part of India, and he was a Muslim, of course, according to the story. Then his son conquered the rest of India, Raja Shulan, and his grandson, Raja Chulan, wanted to go conquer China. So this is the second story, the second chapter of the Malay Annals. So Raja Chulan then sets off to conquer China, and the Chinese hear he's coming. And they're extremely anxious. So they get one of the oldest ships they can find with rotten sails and is falling apart, and they get the oldest men they can find who can still stand up as the crew. And so they send this ship to Temasek. So Temasek appears first in the story, where the Chinese ship comes to Temasek, and they meet Raja Chulan, the Indian king, who's on his way to conquer China. So it's the meeting place between the Chinese and the Indians, is Temasek. And then Raja Chulan meets with the Chinese, these ancient, old, toothless, hairless men, and he asks them how much further to China. And they say, it's 50 years. It'll take you 50 years to get there. We were 20 years old when we left. And so he decides not to go, because he's going to be dead before he gets there. So he stays in Temasek instead. And to console himself, because he didn't get to go to China, he decides to go under the water. So he goes under the water, the Singapore Strait. He has a glass box made for him by his men. He's an underwater archaeologist. So he goes under the Singapore Strait, and he finds a whole other kingdom under the water. They don't know, the people underwater don't know there's a kingdom above the water. And so they're surprised. And so he goes around this kingdom under the water, meets the princess, and marries her. Like, I mean, the exact same thing. The Indian prince comes in and marries with this princess from under the ocean, under the Singapore Strait. And then he has 3 kids, 3 sons. And after a while he gets homesick, wants to go back to India, so he gets on a winged horse, an underwater winged horse, which carries him back to the mouth of the Singapore River. Sets him down there, and then he decides to make his artificers carve a big rock. Split a boulder in 2, carve a rock with characters in Hindustani language, it says in the Malay Annals, and talk about his exploits exploring the undersea kingdom. Then he buries gold and jewels under the rock. So someday he thinks his 3 sons are going to come looking for him, and he won't be there. So he will leave them riches instead so they can make their own kingdoms. Next story, the 3 princes actually arrive. Not in Singapore, they arrive on Bukit Seguntang in Palembang. Somehow they get to Bukit Seguntang, this hill in Sumatra, and they end up there. And then the local people decide to make the eldest one the king of the Minangkabau. And then the second oldest one gets to be the king of Borneo, and the youngest one gets to stay there in Palembang and become the king of that area, which it doesn't say, but we know that was Srivijaya. And so after a while, of course, he gets bored there and wants to go find a better place to found a kingdom. So he sets off, and the queen, again, the queen of Bintan hears he's coming, Sakidar Shah. And that's when she says, oh, if he's an old man, she's an old woman, an old spinster, and so she says, if he's an old man like me, I'll marry him. But if he's too young for me, then I'll adopt him as my son. He's too young. So she adopts him. So again, it's the female ruler of the Singapore area who confers sovereignty on this ruler. He comes, she invents the nobat. She invents the Malay musical instruments, which are a necessity for installing a ruler. So she is the one, again, who gives not only legitimacy to him, but all the Malay rulers after. The rulers of Malacca and so on, Johor, they all have to trace their descent back to her and to this prince from Sumatra. And then the story goes on from there. So now how does this fit in with history? So this is a big telescoping of about 700 years into one man's lifetime. We have all these different kingdoms we know that existed long before Temasek was here. The oldest Malay kingdom we know of is actually in Kedah. That one was already there. We have inscriptions from there already by the 5th century. And then we've got Melayu down in Jambi. Then, of course, we have Palembang. So Melayu actually shows up also in Chinese sources before Srivijaya. Already by the early 7th century, we have references to the kingdom of Melayu. Srivijaya is later in the 7th century. And then, of course, we have Singapore showing up, and then eventually Malacca. So this is the sequence of the major ports in the history of the Malays before and after Singapore. So Hang Tuah, I talked about Hang Tuah already, near Tanjung Kling. Whether or not this is his actual tomb, we'll never know. But obviously it was someone who was really highly honored since he got this 20-meter long grave. And this is the way people normally think Singapore looked. In the Malacca period, in the later period, never looked any differently until the British arrived. This is still how most people perceive Singapore. Never was anything more than this fishing village and pirate lair. But the Malayan elves made Raffles have a very different supposition before he ever set eyes on the island. So there are at least 30 different versions of the Malayan elves. But the oldest one that we know of was written in 1612, and the manuscript was the one that Raffles collected. So it's called Raffles Manuscript number 18. He was a big collector of all kinds of antiquities in Java and later on in Sumatra. At some point he picked up this manuscript of the Malayan elves. It had written in Jawi, but he could read it. Raffles knew Jawi. Actually, he learned Malay on the ship coming to take him to Penang in 1805. He learned Malay already. Nothing else to do. He was obviously very talented where languages go. So this is about Raja Zulkarnain, and that's where it was written, the Raffles version, way up the Johor River in 1612. That's where the Malay capital was in 1612, during all these battles between the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Acehnese, the Malays, and so on. So the capital's way up at Batu Sawar. So that was the perspective from which the oldest known version of the Annals was written. The one that most people know in Singapore is a lot younger. So this is the Raffles Manuscript 18. Most people know the Shellabere version because that was one of the first books printed in Singapore in the 19th century. But the Shellabere version of the Malay Annals was only written in 1750. So 140 years later than the Raffles version. And a lot had changed between 1612 and 1750. For one thing, the Bugis had arrived. After the Dutch took over Makassar, 1667, then a lot of the Bugis migrated to the Singapore Riau area. And so they then quickly became the powers behind the throne in Riau. So Bintan had the Yam Tuan Muda. It's like the Yang de Pertuan, the young prince, in other words, who was the advisor to the Malay sultans, but actually they dictated to the sultans what to do. So the Bugis then rewrote the Malay Annals in Riau and made Hang Tuah a Bugis. So if you read the Shellabere version, you'll see Hang Tuah is actually from Makassar. He's not a Malay. So obviously there's a lot of manipulation of the Malay Annals by different periods. Every time it was rewritten, it took into account the current political situation. So the Bugis imprint on the Shellabere version is really heavy, and it's not even there in the Raffles version at all. So you can see that. So that's why most Singaporeans don't think, either they think Hang Tuah is from Malacca, or if they really read the Malay Annals, the Shellabere version closely, they'll see he's a Bugis prince. And that's why the different names, whether it's Sang Sapurba, Sri Tribuana, Sang Nila Utama, the names again change of the first ruler of Singapore. But I always use the Raffles version because that's the one that suggested to him that Singapore had been an ancient site and then it had potential. So this is about Raja Shulan, and then he goes to China, and so actually this is based on history. Raja Shulan, Raja Chulan, these are both references to Rajendra Chola, who was the king of the Chola Empire in 1025. And in 1025, that's when the Chola Empire down in here actually sent the armada which conquered Srivijaya. So there was a Raja Chulan, or Rajendra Chola, who did conquer Singapore area. And there's a long inscription that was written in 1030, which is on the Tanjore temple, which says all the different names of the ports he conquered, went across the rolling sea. He conquered Kedah, he conquered Srivijaya. He says Srivijaya, he probably means Palembang, and he conquered about 10 other ports in the Straits. There's a whole list of them, all of which we believe were part of the Srivijaya Empire. But for the Tamils, Kedah was the most important. It was the closest to them. They thought of Kedah, the ruler of Kedah, or Kedaram in Tamil, to be the most important of all. So again, from their perspective, Kedah was really a self-standing location. So Raja Chulan was Rajendra Chola. So it is based on a memory of what did occur, this great attack, the Indian prince coming to the Singapore area and taking power. So it says he's from Negapatam, which is still a port city in South India today. So Singapore appears symbolically as this meeting point between the East and West at the very beginning of the Malayan Elves, before there's ever a kingdom. So it's kind of odd. It's kind of anachronistic. They come here, but there's no kingdom yet. But they come here anyway, so this is a bit out of order, it would seem. So he goes back to the mouth of the Singapore River on the winged horse, and there he had his men carve the stone, and it says with Hindustani characters, literally, in the Malayan Elves. And so the stone was probably where the Merlion used to be, at the mouth of the Singapore River. That was the Singapore stone, which is, of course, now the fragment is in the National Museum. It was a boulder which was split in two. And then, of course, the British then split it into many more little pieces when they built Fort Fullerton. So it was right there, and of course, very coincidentally, when Singapore became independent, it set up its own big monument in the same spot. I don't think the guys who designed that Merlion knew what had been there before. But that's exactly the same point. So it was a natural monument place to set up something when you're going to come into the river. That sticks out. But unfortunately, of course, it was blown up. And so we can say enough about it to know that it is written in probably what we call Old Sumatran script. There was a special script that's similar to that used in Java, similar to that used in Bali. They're all based on the early South Indian scripts. Same as modern Thai, modern Khmer, modern Burmese. They all descend from the same ancestor. That script came in around the 3rd century, and then all the different countries in Southeast Asia began to develop their own modifications of it, but they're all related. And so the Malays had their own. Interesting, back in 1999, the first actual book written in that old script was discovered in Sumatra. Dates from the 14th century. So there are still old manuscripts sitting in people's houses in Sumatra. And so this one was only discovered in 1999, and it's written in this old Malay script, and old Malay language. We only understand about half the words in it. It's a legal document. It's the instructions to the people who live in the Kerinci area, West Sumatra, up in the mountains. This is the legal code. It's a 14th century text. Probably they had the same book in Singapore. And so this has been translated into English and published by Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. So we don't know for sure that the Singaporeans had the same legal code, but it could have been. So they did have legal codes at that time, 14th century. We know later on, of course, there was the Undang-Undang Malacca. So the legal codes are one of the main types of literature. We can be sure that the Singaporeans were literate. Nobody asked me about that yesterday. That the Singaporeans could read. Obviously, they had this script. They had this big monument at the river mouth. It was about 50 lines long, a long, long text. It was already badly weathered, though, by the time the British got here. So we can make out a few letters, enough to say the script is the old Malay script. A couple of scholars have tried to make out 1 or 2 words from it, but that's as far as it will probably ever be able to go. Now, there were 3 fragments were salvaged by one of the British officers. After it was blown up, he was upset, so he salvaged 3 fragments, sent them to the East India Company headquarters in Calcutta. One of the 3 fragments got sent back to Singapore in 1918, and that's why we still have it, or we have it back. The other two are still in Calcutta somewhere. I went there with Kwa Chong Guan in 1990. We went there and asked the head of the Calcutta Museum, can you find the other two pieces? And they said, we don't have records that go back to 1843. So if we ever find it, we'll let you know. And that was the last we heard. Now, when Singapore's 50th anniversary came around, the British Council actually tried to help us, to put some more pressure on the Indians to try and find it. They wanted to be, get the prestige for bringing back the Singapore stone. The British couldn't succeed either. So nobody has been able to make the Indians go actually search in the basement of the India Museum in Calcutta to find the Singapore's two more fragments. I imagine the scene like in Raiders of the Lost Ark. We got top men working on it in this giant warehouse. It's buried somewhere under 100 different other boxes and so on. One of my French friends went to Calcutta about 5 years ago. He was looking for it. And he did find one of the old inscriptions from Kedah that no one had seen in 150 years in a broom closet. Because it's not from India. It's not from India, even though it's written in Indian script, but it's not an Indian inscription. Therefore, they stuck it away in the corner because it's not relevant to them. So I suspect the other two Singapore stone fragments are in another closet. They didn't manage to find them yet. But there is hope someday. So what did this say? Well, was it a legal code? Was it some kind of a proclamation? Was it like an oath of loyalty, like a lot of the inscriptions from South Sumatra? Well, we'll never know, unfortunately. I suspect it said, no spitting, no chewing gum, death for drugs. That's my theory. So we excavated around there. We didn't find the treasure. Must be that Sang Nilu Utama did dig up the treasure before he went to Sumatra. We don't know. So we didn't find the treasure supposedly buried under the Singapore stone. But we excavated. This is the excavation at Empress Place, Asian Civilisations Museum building. This is the kind of layer down beneath all the later accumulation. And we found lots of evidence of shipping activity along the riverbank over a period of 300 years. That's how we know Singapore was not abandoned in the 15th, 16th centuries. It was still active. And we have other historical sources, even including the Millennials, the ones that say that Singapore had these 43-masted cruisers here. And it was the Jajahan of the Srivijaya Raja who was the Laksamana. So the winged horse statue was found there in this mud. Must have fallen in the mud somehow. And it's the winged horse with somebody riding it. We don't know who this represents. It's not a standard Indian or Buddhist or Hindu icon. Maybe it represents Raja Chulan coming up from the sea. It might actually be a reference to him on the winged horse coming back and then setting up the inscription. We don't know. But it's a unique statue in all of Southeast Asia because it's made out of lead. It's not bronze, like most statues of this period were. This is the only lead statue ever found in Southeast Asia. Nobody in Thailand, Cambodia, Java used lead for a statue. So why did they use lead? There were lead mines in North Sumatra. So maybe they used it because they had it available. It's in this 14th century Javanese, almost like wayang kulit, shadow puppet style. Very two-dimensional, flat, exaggeratedly thin arms and so on. He's carrying something in his hands like a spear, we don't know what. But he's got wings. It's got very elaborate harnesses and so on. Probably the head is still down there in the mud somewhere. Maybe someday we'll find it again. So we don't know for sure who this represents, but it could be linked to that legend about Raja Chulan. So the headless horse in Empress Place, Raja Chulan's steed, possibly.